They were way more patient and had way more endurance and kept it going for longer than anyone else.
When you look at all these people through history that have made money, lost money, etc., generated great wealth, are there like certain strategies they've deployed?
David Senra, who's a great podcaster, and David's like, did you learn anything from the historical entrepreneurs of Rockefeller or Steve Jobs or Bill Gates? Those people ran their companies for 50 years. They were way more patient and had way more endurance and kept it going for longer than anyone else. The big wealth usually does not come. It almost never comes from like a great idea that just surges out of the middle of nowhere. It's usually like a pretty good idea that you can keep going for 40 years. 99.9% of Warren Buffett's net worth was accumulated after his 60th birthday. Yahoo offered Mark Zuckerberg $1 billion cash. And he was like 19 at the time. And he said, no, I'm going to keep doing this thing. That's the common denominator that ordinary people can learn from, is like endurance and longevity is usually where the big wealth is made.